What if a single moment could change your life forever? One roll, one card, one decision, and suddenly everything is at stake. For thousands of years, gambling has fascinated mankind. It's more than just a game. It's about hope, risk, and the question of whether our fate is really determined by chance, or whether there is something else behind it in the end. Before we dive into this story together, I would like to ask you something. Do you believe that luck really exists in gambling, or is it all just pure mathematics in the end? Be sure to write your opinion in the comments. I'm curious to see how you see it. If you are interested in such topics, if you want to learn more about the background, the history, and the psychology behind it, then feel free to support the video with a like and subscribe to the channel so that you don't miss anything. And now, let's go back to the beginning, to where it all began. Chapter 1: The Origin of Coincidence. Long before there were casinos, cards, or sophisticated strategies, the history of gambling began in a place that seems almost foreign to us today, in the early days of mankind. Back then, when people still lived in small groups, nature determined their lives and much of what happened could not be explained. A fascination developed for something we call coincidence today. But for the people of that time, it was much more than that. It was a sign from the gods, a hint of fate, or perhaps even a message from an invisible world. The first references to gambling date back thousands of years. Archaeological finds show that so-called throwing objects were played with as early as the Paleolithic age. These were often small pieces of bone, especially ankle bones of animals, so-called astragals. These bones had different sides and landed in different positions depending on the throw. Each of these positions could have a specific meaning. In the beginning, these throws were probably less a game in today's sense, but rather a means of divination. People believed that by throwing these bones, they would get answers to important questions. Will the hunt be successful? Is it a good time to move on? Will a sick member of the group survive? But this is exactly where gambling originates. Because these ritual acts slowly developed into a playful element, people began not only to ask questions, but also to compare results with each other. Who would have thrown better? Who had the happier result? The spiritual practice gradually turned into a competition, and with it one of the first forms of gambling emerged. These early games were closely linked to faith. Chance was not a neutral concept, but something meaningful. If a roll was good, it meant that the gods were well disposed. If it was bad, this could be understood as a warning. This way of thinking still influences us more than we might think. People still talk about lucky streaks, bad luck phases, or that fate is playing tricks on them. Over time, the simple bone throws became more and more structured. People began to develop rules. Perhaps it was determined that certain results were worth more than others. Perhaps small objects, food, tools, or trinkets, were used to make the outcome of a game more exciting. Here we see the next crucial step, the use of something valuable. As soon as a risk comes into play, the dynamics change fundamentally. It's no longer just about fun or curiosity, it's about profit and loss. It is interesting that this development took place independently of each other in different parts of the world. Whether in Europe, Asia, or Africa, people everywhere discovered similar forms of play. This suggests that gambling is not a random product of a single culture, but could be deeply rooted in human nature. The allure of risking, the tension of the unknown, and the hope of winning, all of this seems to be universal. Another important aspect is the social function of these early games. Gambling was not only an individual experience, but also a community experience. People came together, watched the throws, cheered along, laughed, or were annoyed together. In a time without modern entertainment, this was one of the few ways to experience excitement and emotion. At the same time, such games could also influence hierarchies. Those who won often may have been seen as particularly lucky. This could change the status within the group. But with the growing importance of gambling came the first problems. Early on, people realized that play not only brings joy, but can also trigger conflicts. If someone lost everything, it could lead to arguments. If someone always won, mistrust could arise. Was it really luck? or was it cheated? These questions are still relevant today and show how old the fundamental challenges of gambling are. Over time, the first real dice developed from the simple bone throws. These were often made of stone, wood, or later ivory and had clearly defined sides. This made the game more precise and comparable. The results were no longer just symbolic, but could be clearly counted. This opened up completely new possibilities. Games could become more complex, rules could be refined, and competition became more intense. At the same time, thinking about probability also developed, albeit unconsciously at first. People began to observe that certain outcomes were more common than others. They developed a sense of what is likely, even if they couldn't yet express it mathematically. This intuitive understanding forms the basis for everything that was later formalized in probability theory. But despite all the developments, one thing remained constant: the emotional power of chance. There's something magical about the moment a cube is in the air. For a brief moment, anything is possible. Past and future disappear, and everything is focused on the outcome of that one throw. This tension, this uncertainty, that's exactly what makes gambling so appealing. And that's exactly what hasn't changed since the first bone throws until today. It's fascinating to see how something as simple as throwing a bone has laid the foundation for a millennia-old tradition. Small, ritual acts gave rise to a worldwide culture that affects billions of people today. But if we go back to the very beginning, we realize that at its core it was always about the same thing: the confrontation with the unknown. For early humans, chance was not an opponent to be defeated, but a force to be understood or perhaps even influenced. Today we see it differently. We try to analyze systems, calculate probabilities, and develop strategies. But the basic fascination remains the same. Perhaps this is exactly the key to understanding gambling. It connects us to our ancestors in ways we often underestimate. Today, when we roll a dice or draw a card, we are basically repeating a ritual that is thousands of years old. We enter into a dialogue with chance, just like people in the Stone Age. And although the world has changed dramatically since then, this one question remains: is it really just a coincidence, or is there more to it? With this question in mind, let's go further, into the first great civilizations, where gambling was not just a pastime, but became an integral part of society. Chapter 2: Gambling in the Early Advanced Civilizations. When the first great advanced civilizations developed, the role of gambling also changed fundamentally. What had previously been mainly a ritual or playful element in small communities now became part of complex societies with fixed structures, hierarchies, and cultural rules. With the rise of cities, writing, and organized religions, gambling also began to gain a new meaning: as entertainment, as a religious tool, and not infrequently as a political instrument. One of the earliest regions where this development can be clearly observed is Mesopotamia, the area between the Euphrates and Tigris rivers, which is often referred to as the cradle of civilization. Some of the first cities in human history were built here over 5,000 years ago. With them came not only administration, trade, and legal systems, but also new forms of play. Archaeological finds show that complex board games already existed in Mesopotamia. One of the most famous is the so-called royal game of yore, which was played around 2600 BC. It consisted of an elaborately designed game board and special game pieces, as well as dice or throwing sticks that determined the course of the game. Even if the exact rules have not been handed down in full, there are many indications that chance played a central role, and thus also the idea of gambling. But in Mesopotamia, gambling was more than just a pastime. It was closely linked to religion and spirituality. People believed that the gods actively intervened in their lives and also expressed themselves through seemingly random events. A roll of the dice could therefore be interpreted as a divine judgment. Priests used similar methods to make decisions or predict the future. The boundary between game and prophecy was fluid. This combination of gambling and religion gave chance a special meaning. It was not arbitrary, but was understood as an expression of a higher will. At the same time, however, a more secular form of the game began to establish itself. People play not only to get answers, but also to compete, entertain, and more often, to win something. A similar picture can be seen in ancient Egypt. Here, too, the game was deeply rooted in the culture. The board game Senet, which was played as early as 3000 BC, is particularly well known. It was not only considered entertainment, but also had a religious meaning. Many accounts show that Senet was associated with the transition to the afterlife. The game became a symbolic journey of the soul, in which the outcome, influenced by throws or lots, could decide the fate of the afterlife. But gambling also played a role in the everyday life of Egyptians. Finds of dice and game boards in simple households show that the game was not only reserved for the elite. People from different social classes took part. This increasingly involved material operations, small objects, food or other valuable goods. This made gambling an integral part of social life. It is interesting that the first forms of regulation and criticism already appeared in these early advanced civilizations. While the game was accepted and even encouraged on the one hand, there were also concerns on the other. Too much play could be seen as a sign of excessiveness or moral decay. This ambivalent attitude towards gambling, between fascination and skepticism, runs through the entire history to the present day. Similar structures have also developed in other parts of the world. In early Indian cultures, for example, there are references to dice games, which are mentioned in both religious texts and literary works. The episode in the Indian epic Mahabharata is particularly well known, in which a dice game plays a central role and has dramatic consequences for the characters involved. Here it becomes clear how gambling can not only be entertainment, but also influence power relations and change entire fates. As these cultures progressed, so did the understanding of rules and fairness. Games became more structured, and the first beginnings of what we would now call game systems emerged. At the same time, however, the possibility of fraud also grew. Manipulated dice, marked pieces, or deliberately influenced results are not modern phenomena. They already existed thousands of years ago. This shows that the appeal of winning is always accompanied by the temptation to control the game. Another important aspect is the role of gambling in the economic context. In some cultures, lottery-like systems were used to distribute resources or finance projects. Even though these early forms were still far from modern lotteries, they show that the principle of awarding prizes by chance was applied in practice early on. In addition, gambling also had a connecting function between different cultures. Through trade and exchange, games spread over long distances. A game that originated in Mesopotamia could reach other regions via trade routes and be adapted there. This created a kind of cultural network of the game, which contributed to the dissemination of ideas and traditions. With the increasing complexity of societies, gambling also became a mirror of this development. It showed social differences, economic dynamics, and cultural values. Who played with whom? Who could afford to lose? Who had access to certain games? All these questions provide insight into the structure of the respective society. Despite all the differences between the cultures, however, there is one thing that runs through them: the fascination for the unpredictable outcome. Whether in the temples of Mesopotamia, the houses of Egypt, or the courtyards of other early civilizations, everywhere people were looking for the same feeling, the moment of decision, when everything is open. It is this moment that makes gambling so special to this day. It combines past and present, simple bone throwing and complex game systems, spiritual rituals and modern entertainment. In the early advanced civilizations, this moment was embedded in a larger social context for the first time. Gambling became visible, tangible, and an integral part of human life. But with this visibility came new questions. How much gambling is too much? Who is allowed to play, and under what conditions? And who is responsible if a game turns serious? These questions became increasingly important in the centuries to come, especially in the great empires of antiquity, where gambling was both encouraged and tightly controlled. There the game developed further, became more intense, more organized, and sometimes more dangerous. And that's exactly where the next chapter takes us. to a world where gods, heroes, and fate are closely intertwined and gambling takes on a whole new meaning. Chapter 3: The Game of the Gods, Ancient Greece. In ancient Greece, gambling reached a new dimension, not only as a pastime or religious ritual, but as a mirror of an entire worldview. The Greeks lived in a culture in which gods, fate, and human action were inextricably linked. Nothing happened without meaning, and even the seemingly random was often understood as an expression of a higher plan. In this field of tension between free will and predetermined fate, gambling also developed further, as something that both entertained and raised deeper questions about life itself. Even in Greek mythology, there are numerous references to games of chance. One of the most famous stories tells that the gods Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades divided the world among themselves, not by war or negotiation, but by lot. Zeus received the sky, Poseidon the sea, and Hades the underworld. This narrative is more than just a myth. It shows how deeply ingrained the idea was that even the most powerful forces in the universe are subject to chance, or at least its symbolism. For the people of ancient Greece, this was a clear message. If even gods let the lot decide, then there must be a special truth in chance. Gambling was thus not seen as a meaningless activity, but as something that is closely linked to the essence of the world. Gambling played an important role in everyday life. Dice games in particular were widespread. Similar to earlier cultures, astragals, i.e. pieces of bone, were often used, but over time, artistically crafted cubes made of stone, metal, or ivory were also added. These dice had clearly defined sides and allowed for more structured games. People met in homes, public places, or special gathering places to play, bet, and test their skills or luck. It was not only about material gain. Gambling was also a social event. It offered the opportunity to make contacts, fight rivalries, and show one's status. Whoever won was admired. Those who lost had to reckon with ridicule or pity. In a society that placed great value on honor and prestige, a game could have far-reaching consequences. However, gambling was not only present in private life, but also in public and religious contexts. This is particularly evident at the Olympic Games. Even though the competitions themselves were not games of chance in the strict sense, a lively betting culture developed around the events. Spectators bet on athletes, speculated about results, and tried to predict the outcome of the games. This form of betting combined sporting performance with the element of chance and made the games even more exciting. At the same time, the connection to religion remained. Oracles played a central role in Greek life, and they too often used elements of chance. In the famous Oracle of Delphi, for example, priestesses interpreted the messages of the gods, which were transmitted in enigmatic statements. Even though no dice were thrown here, the principle was similar. The outcome was unpredictable and had to be interpreted. This proximity between divination and gambling shows how closely the two areas were connected. The philosophical examination of the topic of coincidence is also interesting. Greek thinkers began to think about the nature of chance and to distinguish it from other concepts. Aristotle, for example, dealt intensively with the question of whether coincidence really exists or whether everything follows a certain purpose. For him, coincidence was not an independent principle, but rather the result of events that coincide without a clear intention. These considerations show that gambling was not only practical but also theoretical. But despite this philosophical depth, gambling remained a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it was accepted and widespread, but on the other hand, it was also viewed critically. Excessive gambling in particular could be considered a moral problem. Some thinkers and lawmakers warned that gambling could lead to laziness, greed, or social decay. This criticism is strongly reminiscent of modern discussions and shows that the fundamental questions surrounding gambling are timeless. Another important element was the role of fate, often referred to as Moira in Greek. According to Greek belief, the Moirae, the goddesses of fate, determined the thread of life of every human being. In this context, gambling took on an almost symbolic meaning. Every role, every decision could be understood as a mirror of this greater fate. If someone won, it may have been a sign of divine favor. If someone lost, It could be interpreted as part of an inevitable plan. This mindset has had a profound impact on people's behavior. They often accepted losses with a certain serenity, believing that everything has a higher meaning. At the same time, however, it also increased the appeal of the game. If the outcome is not fully controllable, each moment becomes more intense. The unknown becomes a source of tension and fascination. Over time, a certain professionalism in gambling also developed. Some people became particularly adept at using dice or developed strategies to improve their chances. Even though chance played a central role, many tried to influence it or at least understand it better. This mixture of luck and skill is another aspect that characterizes gambling to this day. But where there is gain, there is also loss, and not infrequently conflicts. Reports from antiquity show that disputes over games were not uncommon. Fraud, manipulation, or just bad luck could lead to arguments. In some cases, laws have even been passed to regulate or restrict gambling. These early attempts at control show that society was already realizing how powerful and potentially problematic the game could be. Despite all the challenges, gambling remained an integral part of Greek life. It was an expression of curiosity, competition, and a desire to explore the unknown. At the same time, it was deeply rooted in culture, in myths, religion, and philosophy. When we look back at ancient Greece today, we realize how crucial this period was for the development of gambling. Here, the game was not only practiced, but also reflected. It became part of a larger narrative about life, destiny, and the role of humans in the universe. And maybe that's exactly the reason why gambling fascinates us to this day. It reminds us that we can't control everything, that there is always a part of life that remains unpredictable, and that it is precisely in this uncertainty that there is a special kind of tension. But while the Greeks integrated gambling into their philosophical and religious systems, another great civilization developed a very special way of dealing with it, characterized by power, excess, and strict control. In the next chapter, we'll take a look at the Roman Empire, where gambling became a mass phenomenon, with all its bright and dark sides. Chapter 4: Empire and Excess. Gambling in the Roman Empire. With the rise of the Roman Empire, gambling reached a new level of spread, intensity, and contradiction. What in earlier cultures had often been a mixture of ritual, play, and social event now became an integral part of everyday life, across all strata of society. At the heart of an empire that spanned much of Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, a gaming culture developed that was as fascinating as it was excessive. The Romans were a people of extremes. They loved spectacle, competition, and entertainment, and it was precisely in this environment that gambling found its ideal breeding ground. Whether in the streets of Rome, in the camps of the legionnaires, or in the villas of the rich, people played everywhere. Dice clacked on stone floors, bets were made, and not infrequently considerable sums changed hands. Dice games, the so-called Alea games, were particularly popular. The term Alea itself became synonymous with gambling and chance in Latin. The game was played with small dice, often made of bone, ivory, or bronze. The rules could vary, but the basic principle was always the same. The outcome was uncertain, and that was exactly the appeal. A famous quote, which has been handed down to this day, illustrates the importance of the game in Roman thought. When Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon in 49 BC and thus triggered the Civil War, he is said to have said, "Alea iacta est," the die is cast. These words are more than just a historical anecdote. They show how deeply the concept of gambling was anchored in cultural consciousness. A decision of this magnitude has been likened to a roll of the dice, as something that can no longer be reversed. But as widespread as gambling was, the way it was dealt with was ambivalent. Officially, it was banned in many forms or at least severely restricted. Especially outside of certain holidays, gambling for money was considered illegal. The Roman authorities repeatedly enacted laws to control gambling. But as so often in history, there was a large gap between law and reality. Despite bans, the game continued to be played, often secretly, sometimes openly, but almost always with great passion. This double standard is a central feature of Roman gambling. On the one hand, it was considered morally questionable, especially if it was practiced excessively. On the other hand, it was so deeply rooted in everyday life that it could hardly be completely suppressed. Even members of the upper class, including senators and emperors, took part in the game. A particularly well-known example is Emperor Claudius, who was known for his preference for dice games. He even reportedly had a special game board built into his carriage so that he could play on the go. These anecdotes show that gambling was not only a pastime of the common people, but was also practiced in the highest circles. In addition to dice games, betting on public events was also extremely popular. The gladiator fights and chariot races in particular attracted large crowds, and with them a lively betting culture. Spectators bet on their favorite fighters or teams, discussed opportunities and strategies, and experienced the events with even greater intensity, as they themselves had something to gain or lose. This form of gambling had an important social function. It connected people from different backgrounds and created a shared experience. At the same time, however, it also increased social tensions. Large gains could change a person's status, while losses could threaten their existence. It is said that some players lost their entire fortune, and in extreme cases, even their freedom. A particularly drastic example of the downsides of gambling is the practice of using oneself or others as a stake. In certain situations, people could risk their freedom and, in the event of defeat, end up in slavery. These extreme risks show how seriously the game was taken and how high the stakes could be. But gambling did not only play a role in private or public spaces. It was also present in the military context. Roman soldiers often used their free time to gamble and bet. This served not only for entertainment, but also for social cohesion. At the same time, however, it could also lead to conflicts, especially when high stakes were involved. Another interesting aspect is the development of game utensils and techniques. The Romans were known for their craftsmanship, and this was reflected in gambling. Dice were manufactured more precisely, game boards were artistically designed, and new variants of games were constantly being created. At the same time, the art of fraud also evolved. Marked dice, manipulated gaming equipment, and sophisticated deceptive maneuvers were part of the repertoire of some players. This constant tension between fairness and fraud is another timeless element of gambling. Where profit is at stake, there is always an attempt to circumvent the system. The Romans were aware of this problem and tried to contain it through laws and social norms, with limited success. Despite all the challenges, gambling remained an integral part of Roman culture. It was an expression of joie de vivre, willingness to take risks, and the desire for excitement. At the same time, however, it also reflected the contradictions of society: wealth and poverty, control and excess, order and chaos. A particularly fascinating aspect is the connection between gambling and belief in fate. Similar to earlier cultures, many Romans believed that the outcome of a game was not purely random, but was influenced by higher powers. Good luck was often interpreted as divine favor, while bad luck was considered a sign of disgrace or fate. This notion added to the emotional significance of the game, making every throw a potentially meaningful event. Over time, gambling developed into a mass phenomenon in the Roman Empire. It was ubiquitous, diverse, and deeply embedded in society. But it was precisely this ubiquity that also led to it being viewed increasingly critically. Moralists and philosophers warned of the dangers of excessive gambling and saw it as a threat to the stability of society. This criticism has been voiced especially in times of political or economic crisis. When people lose their money in the game, it could have not only individual but also societal consequences. Gambling thus became a mirror of the larger problems of the empire. When the Roman Empire finally began to disintegrate, the role of gambling also changed. The large public events became rarer, the economic structures collapsed, and with them a part of the organized gaming culture disappeared. But gambling itself never completely disappeared. It adapted, changed, and found new forms. The Roman era left an important legacy, It showed how powerful and dangerous gambling can be when it becomes an integral part of a large, complex society. She made it clear that the game is not only entertainment, but can also have a profound impact on individuals and communities. And it is precisely these findings that were to be taken up again and again in the coming centuries, especially at a time when new religious and social forces were to fundamentally change the image of gambling. In the next chapter, we turn to another world, one that existed parallel to the Roman Empire and developed its own fascinating forms of gambling, the Far East. Chapter 5: Far Eastern Origins. While in the West gambling developed in the great empires of the Mediterranean region, in the Far East a very special, equally fascinating gambling culture emerged. Some of the earliest and most influential forms of gambling can be traced back to ancient China in particular, many of which still have an impact today. Here, the game was not only associated with entertainment and risk, but also with state organization, philosophy, and technological innovation. The history of gambling in China dates back several thousand years. Even in very early dynasties, there are references to games that were based on chance. Archaeological finds indicate that simple forms of lottery and dice games were widespread. However, unlike many Western cultures, gambling here developed particularly strongly in connection with numbers, symbols, and more complex gaming systems. A significant milestone was the emergence of early lotteries. Historical reports suggest that lottery-like systems were used to finance government projects as early as the Han Dynasty, c. 200 BC to 200 AD. Some sources even suspect that revenues from such games played a role in the construction of large infrastructure projects, possibly even parts of the Great Wall. Even if not all details are clearly proven, this shows how early the principle of playing for a greater purpose was established. This connection between gambling and the state is a central difference to the development in the West. While gambling in the Roman Empire was often in conflict with laws, in China it was sometimes used and organized in a targeted manner. The state recognized early on the potential to generate revenue through the game without increasing direct taxes. At the same time, gambling could be controlled and steered into orderly channels. Another outstanding feature of the Far Eastern gaming culture is the development of card games. Many historians assume that the first playing cards were actually created in China, long before they found their way to Europe. These early cards were often closely associated with paper money, which was also invented in China. It is therefore not surprising that games developed from this, in which cards served as both a means of play and a carrier of value. This innovation had far-reaching consequences. Maps enabled a completely new way of playing. Unlike dice, which are purely random, card games offered room for strategy, memory, and psychological skill. Players could make decisions, bluff, and assess their opponents. This created a new dimension of gambling, a mixture of chance and skill that still characterizes many of the most popular games today. But gambling in China was not just a question of technology or organization. It was deeply embedded in cultural and philosophical ideas. Concepts such as yin and yang, balance and harmony also influenced the perception of luck and chance. The outcome of a game was not seen as simply random, but as part of a larger, often invisible context. This mindset led many players to try to identify patterns or choose opportune times to play. Astrology, numerology, and other forms of interpretation played an important role in this. Certain figures were considered particularly lucky, others unfavorable. This symbolic meaning of numbers is still an important part of many Asian gambling traditions today. At the same time, an ambivalent attitude towards gambling developed here as well. While on the one hand it was widespread and often accepted, on the other hand it was also viewed critically. Confucian thinkers in particular emphasized values such as discipline, moderation, and social responsibility. Excessive gambling could be seen as a sign of weakness or moral failure. This tension between acceptance and criticism led to gambling being treated differently in different eras. In some times it was promoted or at least tolerated, in others it was strictly regulated or banned. But even in phases of strict control, gambling never disappeared completely. It merely shifted into the private sphere or into less visible areas of society. Another interesting aspect is the social diversity of the players. Unlike in some other cultures, gambling in China was not limited to a certain class. Farmers, traders, civil servants, and even members of the elite took part. The game became a unifying element that brought people from different backgrounds together. But this broad participation also had its downsides. As everywhere where profit and loss are at stake, problems arose. Gambling addiction, debt, and social conflicts were also known in China. Reports from various dynasties tell of people who lost all their assets or got their families into trouble. These stories show that the basic risks of gambling are universal, regardless of culture or time. Nevertheless, the fascination remained unbroken. The allure of uncertainty, the hope of winning, and the excitement of the moment attracted people again and again. At the same time, new game variants developed that made the experience more varied and complex. A particularly noteworthy aspect is the role of rituals and superstitions in gambling. Many players developed personal habits or rituals that they believed could affect their luck. Whether it was certain gestures, lucky charms, or fixed routines, all these practices show how strong the need is to gain control over the uncontrollable. This combination of rationality and superstition is still a central feature of gambling today. Even modern players, who know the mathematical basics, often resort to rituals to influence their luck. In China, this connection was particularly clear, as it was deeply rooted in cultural tradition. Over time, many of these game ideas spread to other parts of the world via trade routes. The famous Silk Road played a decisive role in this. Traders, travelers, and explorers brought not only goods, but also games and game concepts. Thus, cards, number lotteries, and other forms of gambling found their way to Central Asia, the Middle East, and finally to Europe. This cultural transmission shows how closely the history of gambling is linked to the general history of mankind. Games were not created in isolation, but part of a global exchange of ideas and practices. The influence of the Far East on the development of gambling can hardly be overestimated. When we look at modern casinos, online platforms, or card games today, we recognize many elements that have their origins in these early Far Eastern traditions. The combination of chance and strategy, the meaning of numbers and symbols, the organization of lotteries, all of this has deep historical roots. But perhaps the most important contribution of this region is another: the realization that gambling is not only an individual experience, but can also fulfill a social function. Whether to finance projects, for entertainment, or as an expression of cultural values, play has become an integral part of life. At the same time, the history of gambling in the Far East shows that every society has to find its own way of dealing with it. There is no universal model that works for everyone. Instead, the different forms of gambling reflect the respective cultural, political, and economic conditions. With this understanding in mind, we now turn to a time when gambling was once again facing major challenges. In medieval Europe, it came under increasing pressure, not least due to the influence of an institution that had a strong influence on people's moral lives. In the next chapter, we see how gambling was pushed into the shadows, and yet never completely disappeared. Chapter 6: Medieval Prohibitions and Clandestine Games. With the transition from the collapse of the Roman Empire to the European Middle Ages, not only the political and social order changed fundamentally, but also the way gambling was dealt with. While it was often practiced openly in antiquity, despite occasional prohibitions, it now came under increasing moral and religious pressure. A new power determined people's everyday lives, the Church. And with it came a new assessment of risk, chance, and human behavior. In medieval Europe, life was strongly influenced by religious ideas. Christian doctrine influenced almost all areas of everyday life, from work and family to leisure and entertainment. In this context, gambling was often viewed critically. It was considered an expression of greed, laziness, and lack of self-control. The idea of hoping for quick profit without working for it contradicted the moral ideals of the time. From the Church's point of view, the connection between gambling and fate was particularly problematic. While earlier cultures often interpreted chance as a divine message, The Christian worldview emphasized that God has a fixed plan and that man should face it with humility. The arbitrary temptation of fate through games was therefore often considered presumptuous or even sinful. This attitude led to gambling being officially banned or severely restricted in many regions. Church authorities preached against gambling, and secular rulers passed laws prohibiting certain forms of gambling. Dice games in particular were the focus of criticism, as they were considered a symbol of uncontrolled chance. But as so often in history, a ban did not lead to disappearance, but to relocation. Gambling didn't disappear, it went underground. Clandestine games became an integral part of medieval life. In taverns, backyards, or private rooms, people met to play, bet, and escape everyday life for a moment. These secret games often had a special atmosphere. They were characterized by tension, risk, and the knowledge that you were doing something forbidden. It was precisely this combination that made them even more appealing to many people. The game became not only a pastime, but also an act of resistance against social norms. Interestingly, despite all the prohibitions, gambling was still allowed or at least tolerated in certain contexts. For example, there were exceptions on public holidays or special occasions. During such times, gaming was considered less problematic because it was embedded in a festive setting. This selective acceptance shows that even strict moral systems leave room for flexibility. Another important factor was the social diversity of the players. In the Middle Ages, gambling was not a privilege of a certain class. Farmers, craftsmen, merchants, and even nobles took part. While the common people often played for small amounts, significantly higher stakes could be involved in the circles of the nobility. Especially at princely courts, a separate gaming culture developed, in which card and dice games were part of the entertainment of the elite. Especially in these higher circles, gambling was sometimes even regarded as an expression of sophistication and skill. Those who played well proved not only luck, but also intelligence and strategic thinking. Nevertheless, the danger of excess remained here as well. Stories of nobles who lost large parts of their fortunes are not uncommon. A significant change in medieval gambling was the spread of card games in Europe. These probably came from the East via trade routes and became increasingly widespread in the course of the late Middle Ages. Cards opened up new possibilities for the game, more complex, more strategic, and often more socially interactive than the classic dice games. But even these new games quickly became the focus of criticism and bans. In some regions, maps were even officially banned because they were considered dangerous or immoral. Nevertheless, they continued to spread, another example of how difficult it is to completely suppress gambling. In addition to the moral and religious aspects, the economic situation also played a role. The Middle Ages were characterized by insecurity, poverty, and great social differences. For many people, gambling offered a rare chance to improve their situation, even if the probability of this was low. The hope of a profit could be particularly strong in difficult times. At the same time, it is precisely this hope that could also become a trap. People who lost repeatedly got into debt or lost important resources. In extreme cases, this led to social decline or even complete impoverishment. These negative consequences increased criticism of gambling and provided arguments for further bans. Another aspect that gained importance in the Middle Ages was how to deal with fraud. Since many games took place in secret and there were no uniform rules or controls, the risk of manipulation was particularly high. Marked dice, marked cards, or agreed game courses were widespread. Trust became a central but often fragile foundation of the game. This uncertainty led to the fact that gambling was not only associated with excitement, but also with mistrust. Players not only had to hope for their luck, but also trust that the game was fair. This double uncertainty made the experience more intense, but also more risky. Despite all these challenges, gambling remained an integral part of life. It adapted to the conditions of the time, changing its forms and always finding new ways to exist. Whether in the shadow of the church or in the splendor of the princely courts, the game remained present. A particularly interesting point is that it was precisely the attempts to ban gambling that contributed to its further development. The relocation to private rooms created new game variants that were better adapted to this environment. At the same time, external pressure led to players becoming more creative, both in the game itself and in the way they organized it. With the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the Renaissance, the perspective changed again. Strict moral ideas were questioned, science and art experienced an upswing, and gambling was also viewed in a new light. The emergence of modern mathematics in particular was to fundamentally change the understanding of chance and probability. But before we look at this next step, it's worth pausing for a moment and realizing the importance of the Middle Ages in the history of gambling. It was a time of restriction, but also of adaptation. A time in which the game did not disappear, but reinvented itself. And perhaps it is precisely this phase that shows most clearly how deeply gambling is anchored in human behavior. Even under strict prohibitions and moral pressure, it found ways to survive. It's more than just a game, it's an expression of hope, risk, and a desire to challenge one's fate. With this thought, we continue into an era that not only made gambling more visible again, but also began to understand it scientifically. In the Renaissance, the game met mathematics, and thus changed forever. Chapter 7: Renaissance and the Birth of Probability. With the transition from the Middle Ages to the Renaissance, the world changed in many ways, and with it the understanding of gambling. The Renaissance was a time of awakening, curiosity, and the rediscovery of knowledge. Art, science, and philosophy experienced a boom that permanently changed people's thinking. In this new intellectual climate, gambling was no longer seen as a moral problem or a forbidden pastime, but increasingly as a phenomenon that could be understood, analyzed, and even calculated. For the first time in history, man began not only to accept or fear chance, but to study it systematically. This development marks a decisive turning point. A mystical concept became an object of scientific curiosity. A central figure in this change was Girolamo Cardano, an Italian physician, mathematician, and passionate gambler of the 16th century. Cardano was not only a scholar, but also a practical observer of gambling. He played regularly himself and was fascinated by the patterns that could be seen. In his work Liber de Ludo Alii, Book on Gambling, he tried to understand the principles behind chance. He analyzed dice games, calculated possible outcomes, and developed the first approaches to what we know today as probability theory. For Cardano, gambling was no longer pure luck, but a system that follows certain rules, even if these rules are not visible at first glance. This realization was revolutionary. It challenged the millennia-old notion that the outcome of a game is determined solely by divine forces or pure chance. Instead, she showed that there are patterns, probabilities that can be calculated, and thus also possibilities to make better decisions. But Cardano was just the beginning. In the course of the Renaissance and the following centuries, more and more thinkers dealt with the topic of probability. Particularly important was the exchange between mathematicians who tried to solve concrete problems from gambling. Questions such as how should a bet be divided if a game ends prematurely led to intensive discussions and new mathematical methods. This development had far-reaching consequences. It not only led to the emergence of probability theory, but also influenced many other fields, from statistics to physics to economics. But its roots lie in gambling, in the simple question, how likely is it to win? At the same time, the social perception of gambling also changed. While in the Middle Ages it often took place in secret, it now became more visible and accepted again. New places of play were created in the cities of Europe, taverns, salons, and private societies where card and dice games were used for entertainment. Card games in particular gained in importance during this time. They offered a combination of chance and strategy that fit perfectly with the new thinking of the Renaissance. Players could not only rely on their luck, but also use their skills, observe, plan, bluff. The game became an intellectual challenge. This development reflected the spirit of the time. People began to understand the world not only through faith, but also through reason. They were looking for rules, for systems, for explanations. And gambling became an area where this search was particularly evident. But despite all the progress, the game also remained a place of emotions. The tension, the hope, the disappointment, none of this could be calculated. Even if you know the probability of an event, the outcome remains uncertain. It is precisely this mixture of predictability and unpredictability that makes gambling so fascinating. Another important aspect of the Renaissance was the increasing connection between gambling and business. With the growth of trade in cities, a new form of prosperity emerged, and with it new opportunities to bet and win money. Gambling became a part of economic life, even if it was often viewed critically. At the same time, the first forms of organized games and betting developed. Rules were set, stakes standardized, and structures were created that made the game more reliable. These developments laid the foundation for the later casinos and modern gambling systems. But as in earlier eras, the criticism remained. Many continued to see gambling as a danger, especially if it was practiced excessively. The new mathematical findings did not change the fact that people could lose their money. On the contrary, they perhaps made the game even more enticing, as it now had the appearance of control and understanding. One particularly interesting point is that while mathematics can describe the probability of an event, it cannot predict the outcome of a single game. Every dice roll, every card drawn remains an individual event. This limit of predictability is crucial, and it shows that, despite all the science, gambling will always retain an element of uncertainty. The Renaissance thus brought a double change. On the one hand, gambling became more rational, structured, and better understood. On the other hand, it remained emotional, unpredictable, and fascinating. This tension between knowledge and uncertainty characterizes gambling to this day. When we look back at this period, we realize how crucial it was to the development of the modern understanding of chance. The ideas that emerged at that time form the basis for many areas of our lives today, from insurance to financial markets to scientific models. And yet it all started with a simple game, with dice, cards, and the question of how likely a certain outcome is. Perhaps this is precisely the special importance of gambling in history. It was not only entertainment, but also an engine for insight. It forced people to think about chance, recognize patterns, and develop new ways of thinking. With this new understanding of probability and risk, we are now entering a time when gambling has not only been better understood, but also more organized. Places created specifically for the game were created, places where risk, entertainment, and social life came together in a unique way. In the next chapter, we'll see how the game became an institution, and how the first casinos came into being. Chapter 8. The first casinos emerge. With the progress of the Renaissance and the growing understanding of probability, risk, and gambling continued to evolve, no longer just as a private pursuit or half-hidden activity, but as an organized form of entertainment. For the first time, improvised game rounds in taverns and salons gave rise to places that were specifically created for gambling. This marked the beginning of a new era, the birth of the casino. The term casino originally comes from Italian and initially meant nothing more than a small house or a place of gathering. It was only over time that it developed into the meaning we know today, a place where people play, bet, and risk. One of the first known places of this kind was built in the 17th century in Venice, a city that stood for trade, wealth, and cultural exchange like no other. In 1638, the Ridotto was opened there, a state-controlled gaming venue that is considered one of the first official casinos in the world. It was founded to regulate gambling during the carnival season and at the same time to steer it into orderly channels. Instead of banning gambling, they decided to control it, an approach that is still used in many countries today. The Ridotto was not a place for everyone. Entry was often subject to certain conditions, and the dress code ensured that wealthy citizens and nobles in particular had access. Masks were common during carnival, which created an interesting dynamic. Identities could be hidden, social boundaries blurred, and the game gained an extra layer of mystery and tension. These early casinos offered various games, including card and dice games, which had already been popular in previous centuries. But in contrast to earlier times, there were now fixed rules, organized processes, and often a kind of house that was involved in the game itself. This was a decisive step. Gambling was institutionalized. With this institutionalization, the role of the player also changed. The game was no longer just a spontaneous activity among friends or acquaintances, but part of a structured system. There were fixed stakes, clearly defined rules, and often professional croupiers who ran the game. This structure made gambling more accessible, but also more controllable. At the same time, however, it brought a new dimension into play, the concept of the house edge. While in private games all participants theoretically had the same chances, in a casino the system was designed in such a way that the operators benefit in the long term. This principle is still a fundamental element of gambling today, and shows how the game evolved from a social activity to an economic model. The idea of the casino quickly spread across Europe. Cities such as Paris, Baden-Baden, and later Monte Carlo became centers of gambling. Especially in times when gambling was prohibited in other regions, these places offered a legal alternative. They attracted travelers, nobles, and adventurers from all over Europe. This development made the casino more than just a place to play. It became a social meeting place, a place of encounter, exchange, and self-expression. People came not only to play, but also to be seen, to socialize, and to be part of an exclusive world. The atmosphere of these early casinos was one of elegance, excitement, and an air of danger. Candlelight, elaborate clothing, and the soft clinking of coins created a unique atmosphere. Every room was filled with expectations, the hope of profit, and the fear of loss. But despite all its elegance, gambling remained a risky undertaking. Many players lost large sums of money, and it was not uncommon for this to lead to personal tragedies. Stories of people who had gambled away their fortunes spread quickly and contributed to the ambivalent perception of the casino. It was a place of opportunity, but also of risks. This ambivalence was also reflected in the attitude of society. While some saw the casino as a symbol of progress, freedom, and entertainment, others saw it as a place of temptation and moral decay. This discussion accompanies gambling to this day. Another important aspect was the increasing professionalization of the game. New games were developed, existing rules were refined, and standardized procedures were created that made the gaming experience more consistent. Games like roulette, which became popular in France in the 18th century, combined chance and structure in a way that fit perfectly with the casino concept. Roulette is a good example of the combination of mathematics and gambling. The game is based on clear probabilities, but for the player, the outcome of each spin remains uncertain. This combination of predictability and unpredictability is what makes it so appealing, a principle that was already recognized in the Renaissance and has now been put into practice in casinos. Over time, casinos also became important economic factors. They generated revenue, created jobs, and attracted tourists. In some regions, they were specifically promoted in order to strengthen the local economy. Especially in smaller principalities or cities without a large industrial base, gambling offered an attractive source of income. But with the economic success came new challenges. The regulation of gambling became an important issue. How can you make sure that the game is fair? How to protect players from excessive losses? And how do you prevent fraud or criminal activity? These questions led to the development of rules, laws, and control mechanisms that were intended to make gambling safer and more transparent. At the same time, however, a certain gray area remained in which legal and illegal activities could overlap. A particularly interesting point is the role of the casino as a mirror of society. The people who played there brought their own values, hopes, and fears with them. The casino became a place where social dynamics are particularly evident. Wealth and poverty, risk and security, control and chance, all these opposites meet here. When we look back at the emergence of the first casinos today, we realize how crucial this development was for the history of gambling. It marks the transition from an individual or collective game to an organized, economically oriented institution. The casino is not just a place, but a concept, a space where chance is controlled, where risk is part of the system, and where people are always trying to conquer the unknown. But while these new gambling venues were established in Europe, gambling spread across the globe at the same time, especially through the great voyages of discovery and colonialism. Games, ideas, and concepts were transported across continents and embedded in new cultural contexts. In the next chapter, we will see how gambling reached the New World, and how it took its own development there. Chapter 9: Gambling and Colonialism. With the advent of the Age of Discovery and the spread of European powers across new continents, not only did the political map of the world change, but gambling also entered a new phase. Games, rules, and concepts that had developed over centuries in Europe, Asia, and the Mediterranean were now carried across oceans. At the same time, they encountered new cultures, traditions, and ways of life. The result was a complex mixture of game ideas that had a lasting impact on gambling. When European colonial powers began to settle parts of the Americas, Africa, and Asia, they brought with them not only their language, religion, and economic systems, but also their leisure culture, and thus gambling. Cards, dice, and lotteries were part of the everyday experience of many settlers. In a new, often uncertain environment, the game offered a familiar form of entertainment and distraction. Especially in the so-called New World, i.e. the American continents, gambling quickly became an integral part of life. In the early colonies of North America, it was practiced both privately and publicly. Settlers played in their homes, in inns, or at community meetings. But soon the economic potential of the game was recognized here as well. Lotteries played a central role in this. At a time when state structures were still being built up and financial resources were often scarce, they offered an effective way to collect money. Numerous projects have been funded by lotteries, including roads, bridges, public buildings, and even educational institutions. Some of the first universities in North America received part of their funding through such systems. This use of gambling as a financial instrument is a remarkable aspect of the colonial era. It shows that the game was not only seen as entertainment, but also as a practical tool. The idea that many people make small efforts to achieve a big goal together was attractive then as it is today. But in addition to this organized form of gambling, a lively, often unregulated gambling culture also developed. Especially in border regions, where state control was weaker, gambling flourished. Traders, adventurers, and settlers met to play, bet, and try their luck. These places were characterized by freedom, but also by insecurity. A particularly important aspect of this time was cultural exchange. European games met the traditions of indigenous peoples, who often had their own forms of gambling. In many indigenous cultures, games were based on chance and were used for both entertainment and ritual purposes. This encounter led to new variants of play and mutual influence. But this exchange was not always equal. Colonial expansion was often marked by power imbalances, and this was also reflected in gambling. European gaming systems often prevailed, while local traditions were suppressed or changed. At the same time, colonial powers sometimes used gambling purposefully to exert control or gain economic advantage. Another important factor was the role of risk in a time of uncertainty. Life in the colonies was often marked by dangers, diseases, conflicts, economic difficulties. In this context, gambling could take on a special meaning. It offered the opportunity to win quickly and improve one's own situation, but also the chance to escape everyday life for a moment. This connection between uncertainty and gambling is a recurring theme in history. In times when life is unpredictable, the willingness to take risks often increases. The game becomes a mirror of this uncertainty, and at the same time an attempt to control it. Over time, the colonies developed their own gambling cultures. In North America, new card games and forms of betting were created that were adapted to local conditions. These games laid the foundation for later developments that would influence gambling worldwide. At the same time, criticism also grew. Religious groups, especially in the English colonies, saw gambling as a moral danger. They warned of the negative consequences: debt, disputes, social instability, and called for stricter rules. In some regions, these demands led to bans or restrictions. But as in earlier eras, it became clear that gambling could not be completely suppressed. It shifted, adapted, and found new ways to exist. Even in strictly regulated areas, games continued to be played, often in secret, sometimes openly, but always with great appeal. A particularly exciting aspect of the colonial era is the emergence of a global network of gambling. Through trade and migration, games spread across continents. A card game that was developed in Europe could be modified in America and later returned to Europe in a new form. This constant exchange led to increasing diversity and dynamism in gambling. The game also gained further economic importance. In some regions, it became an important part of local economies. Taverns, playhouses, and other establishments attracted players and generated revenue. At the same time, the first forms of professional gamers emerged, people who tried to earn a living through the game. But this professionalization also brought new challenges. Fraud, manipulation, and conflicts were widespread. Without uniform rules or control mechanisms, it was often difficult to ensure fairness. This led to a certain distrust of the game, which is still reflected in many discussions today. When we look back at the colonial era, we realize how crucial it was to the global spread of gambling. Games were transported, adapted, and reinterpreted. Gambling has become a worldwide phenomenon that crosses cultural boundaries and connects people in different ways. At the same time, this epoch shows that gambling must always be understood in the context of its environment. It is not only a game, but also an expression of social, economic, and political conditions. In the colonial era, it became a tool, a risk, and an opportunity at the same time. With the end of this phase and the transition to the 19th century, the world changed again. Industrialization, urbanization, and new social structures led to a further transformation of gambling. Especially in North America, a gambling culture developed that still has an effect today, characterized by freedom, risk, and the myth of quick profit. In the next chapter, we dive into this world, a time of saloons, maps, and legends, in which gambling took on a character of its own. Chapter 10: The Wild Game, Gambling in the 19th Century. At the beginning of the 19th century, gambling entered a new stage, one that was characterized by expansion, industrialization, and an attitude to life between departure and lawlessness. Especially in North America, a gaming culture developed that is still legendary today: gambling in the Wild West. Here, in a world of dusty streets, improvised settlements, and constant change, the game became a symbol of risk, freedom, and the dream of getting rich quickly. The United States was in a period of rapid growth. New areas were developed. Gold rushes and land grabbing attracted thousands of people to previously undeveloped regions. In these border areas, there was often little state control, hardly any fixed structures, but all the more opportunities. And it was precisely in this environment that gambling flourished. Saloons became the central places of this new gaming culture. They were much more than just bars, meeting places, trading places, social centers, and above all, places of play. Gold prospectors, cowboys, traders, and adventurers met here to drink, exchange stories, and try their luck. The sound of cards on wood, the clinking of coins, and the tense silence before a decision was part of everyday life. One of the most famous games of that time was poker. Even though its origins are older and influences come from Europe, it developed into the game we know today in the USA in the 19th century. Poker was more than just a game of chance. It was a game of psychology. Bluffing, assessing, deceiving, all of this played a decisive role. Chance determined the cards, but man determined how he played them. This mixture of luck and skill made poker particularly fascinating. It fit perfectly with the mentality of the Wild West. If you were brave, took risks, and understood your opponents, you could win, at least in theory. In practice, however, the game was often rough and unpredictable. Cheating was not uncommon, and it was not uncommon for disputes at the gaming table to end in violence. The line between play and seriousness was thin. It was not only about money, but often also about honor, pride, and survival. A lost game could have far-reaching consequences, financially, but also socially. At the same time, a big win could change someone's life. These extremes made gambling a mirror of the times, uncertain, intense, and full of possibilities. But the Wild West was only part of the development. Gambling also played an important role in the growing cities of the East Coast and Europe. With industrialization, new forms of prosperity emerged, but also new social tensions. Factory workers, traders, and entrepreneurs were looking for entertainment, and often found it in the game. In many cities, gambling houses were built, which were reminiscent of European casinos, but were often less regulated. This was where people played, bet, and speculated. In addition to poker, games such as Faro, a card game that was widely used in the 19th century, were particularly popular. Faro was fast, easy to understand, and yet offered excitement, ideal for a time when everything was accelerating. At the same time, the organization of gambling also increased. In some regions, laws have been passed to regulate or restrict gambling. But similar to earlier eras, implementation often remained difficult. Gambling was too popular, too deeply embedded in everyday life, to be fully controlled. Another important aspect of this period was the connection between gambling and mobility. With the expansion of railways and steamships, people became more mobile. Games traveled with them, from city to city, from region to region. Especially on river ships, such as on the Mississippi, a gambling culture of its own developed. These floating venues were known for their lively atmosphere, but also for their risks. People from the most diverse backgrounds met on such ships. Merchants, travelers, gamblers, all united by a common interest in the game. But here too, the following applies. Where a lot of money is involved, conflicts are not far away. Fraud, manipulation, and disputes were part of everyday life, and not everyone left the ship as a winner. In addition to the practical side of gambling, a cultural image of it also developed in the 19th century. Stories, legends, and tales of famous players, big wins and dramatic losses shaped the idea of gambling. The player became a kind of character, a symbol of courage, risk, and individualism. This romanticized portrayal had a great influence on the perception of gambling. It was seen not only as an activity, but as a lifestyle. The idea of putting all your eggs in one basket and either winning it all or losing it all was a perfect fit at a time when the world was changing rapidly and traditional securities were disappearing. But behind this fascination, there were also real problems. Gambling addiction, debt, and social conflicts were widespread. Many people lost more than they could afford and ended up in difficult situations. These downsides led to gambling once again becoming the focus of criticism. Religious groups, reform movements, and political actors demanded stricter rules. In some regions, gambling houses have been closed, games banned, or severely restricted. Especially towards the end of the century, the pressure to control gambling increased. This development once again shows the central tension in the history of gambling, between freedom and control, between fascination and danger. The game attracts people, offers opportunities and excitement, but it also carries risks that cannot be ignored. Another interesting point is the increasing professionalization of the game. Some players developed strategies, observed patterns, and tried to improve their chances. At the same time, the first beginnings of professional players, who earned their living through the game, emerged. But they too were subject to chance, a factor that can never be fully controlled. When we look back at the 19th century, we see a time of transition. Gambling was ubiquitous, diverse, and deeply embedded in society. At the same time, an awareness of its effects began to develop, both positive and negative. The combination of gambling and myth was particularly formative. The Wild West, the saloons, the card tables, all of this became part of a narrative that continues to have an impact today. Films, books, and stories take up this image again and again and intensify the fascination. But the reality was more complex. Behind the legends were real people, real risks and real consequences. Gambling was not a romantic adventure, but a part of life, with all its ups and downs. With the transition to the 20th century, gambling was to change again. The improvised venues of the Wild West increasingly developed into organized structures. Cities began to use the potential of gambling in a targeted manner, and one of them was to play a very special role in this. In the next chapter, we will turn to this city, a place that stands for gambling like no other and that emerged from the developments of the 19th century, Las Vegas. Chapter 11: The Birth of Las Vegas. By the time the 20th century began, gambling had already had a long and checkered history, from ritual beginnings to forbidden games in the Middle Ages to the legendary saloons of the Wild West. But with the emergence of a city in the middle of the desert, gambling was to change fundamentally once again. This city was Las Vegas, a place that stands for risk, entertainment, and the dream of winning big like no other. Originally, Las Vegas was little more than a small stopover in the Nevada desert. It was not until the construction of the railway at the beginning of the 20th century that the region gained in importance. But the decisive turning point came in the 1930s, a time marked by the Great Depression. Millions of people lost their jobs, and the state of Nevada was also looking for ways to stabilize its own economy. In 1931, Nevada made a decision that would leave a lasting mark on the history of gambling. Gambling was legalized. While many other regions tried to ban or restrict the game, Nevada went the opposite way. The economic potential was recognized and the decision was made to use it in a targeted manner. This legalization coincided with another major project, the construction of the Hoover Dam. Thousands of workers poured into the region, and with them came the demand for entertainment. Las Vegas began to grow, slowly at first, then faster and faster. The first casinos emerged, often still simple and functional, but they laid the foundation for what was to follow. In the decades that followed, Las Vegas developed into a center of gambling. Especially in the 1940s and 1950s, the city experienced a real boom. Large hotels with integrated casinos were built, offering not only the game, but also entertainment, luxury, and spectacular staging. Gambling became part of an overall experience. An important, albeit controversial, factor in this development was the involvement of organized crime. At a time when government control was still limited, various groups invested in the construction and operation of casinos. They brought capital, organization, and experience with them, but also illegal activities. This phase had a lasting impact on the image of Las Vegas and gave the city a reputation that fluctuated between glamour and danger. But at the same time, the picture began to change. With increasing government regulation and growing economic interest, gambling became more and more controlled and professionalized. Investors, companies, and authorities worked to make Las Vegas a safe and attractive destination for visitors from all over the world. During this phase, what we now know as the Las Vegas Strip was created, a collection of huge hotel and casino complexes that stretch along a street and offer a unique experience. Here, gambling became part of a larger staging. Lights, shows, music, and architecture merged into a world that was deliberately exaggerated and spectacularly designed. The game itself remained at the center, but it was embedded in an environment that intensified emotions and was intended to make the stay unforgettable. Players could not only win or lose, but also become part of a special atmosphere, a mixture of luxury, excitement, and illusion. A decisive aspect of this development was the change in the target group. While gambling used to be often associated with specific social groups or places, it became a mass attraction in Las Vegas. People from different countries, cultures, and backgrounds traveled to the city to try their luck. Gambling became global. At the same time, the variety of games also developed. In addition to classic table games such as blackjack, roulette, and poker, slot machines in particular gained in importance. These so-called slots were easy to use, visually appealing, and offered quick results. They made gambling even more accessible and appealed to a wider audience. Another important point was the role of technology and design. Casinos have been designed to keep the player in the game for as long as possible. Light, sounds, architecture, Everything was deliberately used to create a certain atmosphere. Time and space seemed to have a different meaning in the casino. Windows were rare, clocks hardly visible. The focus was entirely on the game. This targeted design shows how much gambling had developed into a well-thought-out system. It was no longer just about the game itself, but about the entire experience. Psychology, economics, and entertainment merged into a complex concept that was copied worldwide. But despite all the successes, criticism was not absent. For many, Las Vegas became a symbol of excess, waste, and moral questionability. The idea that people can lose large sums of money in a short period of time has repeatedly led to discussions about the responsibility of operators and the role of the state. At the same time, however, there was also a different perspective. For many people, Las Vegas was a place of freedom, a place where you could get away from it all, take risks, and maybe even change your life. This ambivalence is a central component of the city's identity. Over time, Las Vegas continued to develop. The connection between gambling and entertainment became stronger and stronger. Big shows, concerts, and events made the city a versatile destination. The casino was only one part of a larger offer that focused on experience and staging. This development also had an impact on global gambling. Other regions began to adopt similar concepts. Cities and countries recognized the economic potential and invested in their own casino centers. Las Vegas became a role model, and at the same time a benchmark. When we look at the history of Las Vegas today, we see more than just the development of a city. We see the transformation of gambling itself. A simple game became an industry, individual players became millions of visitors, spontaneous bets became a global business. And yet the core remains unchanged. Even in the largest casinos in the world, it's ultimately about the same moment as thousands of years ago, the moment when everything is open. The roll, the card, the spin, and the hope that luck is on your side this time. Las Vegas has perfected this moment, staged it, and put it into a form that is understood worldwide. But at the same time, it also raises questions. How much control is possible? How much risk is acceptable? And what responsibility do those who offer the game bear? These questions will become even more important in the next chapter. As the 20th century progressed, gambling changed again, due to new laws, new technologies, and new social developments. We are now moving into a time when gambling is finally becoming global, and in which it is more than ever between regulation and freedom. Chapter 12. Gambling in the 20th century. As the 20th century progressed, gambling changed from a regional activity to a global phenomenon that was closely intertwined with politics, economics, and social developments. While places like Las Vegas had already become symbols of a new era of gambling, the game was also beginning to take root in many other parts of the world, sometimes legally, partly in secret, often accompanied by intense debates about morality, control, and economic opportunity. One of the central developments of this time was the increasing legalization and regulation of gambling. Many states realized that a complete ban was hardly enforceable and often created more problems than it solved. Illegal playing rings, fraud, and a lack of control made it clear that a regulated framework could offer advantages. Thus, numerous countries decided to place gambling under state supervision, to issue licenses, and to define clear rules. This regulation had several goals. It was supposed to ensure fairness, protect players, and at the same time generate revenue for the state. Taxes on gambling became an important source of revenue, which in many cases was used for public projects. This brought back a principle that had already existed in earlier times: gambling as an economic instrument. But the path to get there was not a straight line. In many countries, gambling was initially severely restricted or even banned before it was later allowed again. This changeable development shows how controversial the topic was, and still is today. Societies are always wrestling with the question of how much gambling is acceptable and what limits should be set. A particularly formative aspect of the 20th century was the role of organized structures in gambling. In some regions, especially in the early decades, the game was closely linked to criminal networks. These groups took advantage of the high demand and the often unclear legal situation to set up their own systems. They ran gambling houses, organized bets, and controlled entire markets. Over time, states reacted to this development. Through stricter laws, controls, and the introduction of state-licensed casinos, attempts were made to free gambling from the influence of such structures. This process was lengthy and not always successful, but it ultimately led to a greater institutionalization of the game. At the same time, technology continued to develop, and with it gambling. Especially the introduction and spread of slot machines had an enormous influence. These devices, which had already been invented in the late 19th century, were further developed and perfected in the 20th century. They were easy to use, visually appealing, and offered quick results. Slot machines fundamentally changed the dynamics of gambling. While many classic games required social interaction, you could now play alone. The player was no longer dependent on others, but interacted directly with the machine. This made gambling more accessible, but also more intense. Another important factor was the increasing internationalization. Gambling centers sprang up not only in the United States, but also in Europe, Asia, and other parts of the world. Places like Monte Carlo or Macau developed their own identities and attracted players from all over the world. Gambling became a global market, with different regions competing with each other. At the same time, awareness of the risks of gambling grew. With the increasing availability and popularity, the dark side also became more visible. Gambling addiction, debt, and social problems came more into focus. Scientists, politicians, and social organizations began to deal more intensively with these topics. The term gambling addiction has been increasingly recognized and researched. It was recognized that gambling is not only a question of willpower, but that psychological mechanisms also play a role. Reward systems in the brain, the effect of wins and losses, and the design of the games themselves influence player behavior. These findings led to new approaches to gambling. Education, prevention, and offers of help became more important. At the same time, operators were expected to take responsibility and take measures to protect players. Another significant change was the combination of gambling and media. With the advent of television and later digital media, games, tournaments, and competitions were made accessible to a wide audience. Poker tournaments, sports betting, and other forms of gambling became part of entertainment culture. This media presence increased the fascination of the game. Big wins, exciting moments, and charismatic players were staged and disseminated. The game of chance was not only played, but also consumed, as a spectator experience. But here, too, the ambivalence was evident. While some saw the new visibility as an opportunity, others criticized the possible trivialization of the risks. Displaying winnings could create unrealistic expectations and entice people to gamble themselves. In the course of the 20th century, gambling developed in several directions at the same time. It became more legal and regulated, but also more global and complex. It became part of the economy, entertainment, and culture, and at the same time a topic for politics, science, and society. A particularly important point is the increasing professionalization. Casinos became companies that operated according to clear economic principles. Marketing, design, and strategy played an increasingly important role. Gambling became an industry that was purposefully designed and optimized. This development also brought with it new questions. How far can you go to attract and retain players? What responsibility do operators have towards their customers? And how can you find a balance between economic success and social responsibility? When we look back at the 20th century, we see a time of transformation. Gambling has become more modern, structured, and ubiquitous. It adapted to new technologies, new markets, and new social conditions. But despite all these changes, one central aspect remains: the human fascination with the unknown. The desire to take risks, the hope of winning, and the excitement of the moment are timeless. They connect 20th century players with their ancestors from ancient times and beyond. However, with the end of the century and the beginning of the digital age, gambling is facing another, perhaps even bigger change. New technologies are opening up possibilities that were previously unthinkable. The game leaves the physical space and becomes part of a networked world. In the next chapter, we'll dive into this digital revolution and see how gambling is making the leap to the internet and is once again fundamentally changing as a result. Chapter 13: Digital Revolution, Online Gambling. With the advent of the internet into people's everyday lives, a new era of gambling began, the digital revolution. While physical gaming venues such as taverns, casinos, or saloons were the central stage for dice, cards, and machines for thousands of years, the digital world opened up completely new possibilities. Players could now participate anytime, anywhere, and gambling became not just local but global. The first approaches to online gambling emerged in the 1990s. With the spread of the internet, entrepreneurs saw the opportunity to transfer the traditional gambling halls to the digital world. Websites that initially simulated simple casino games allowed users to virtually draw cards, roll dice, or spin slot machines. The attractiveness was obvious: no travel, no opening hours, and the possibility to play anonymously. Early online casinos offered a limited selection of games, but they laid the foundation for an industry that now generates billions in revenue. Operators quickly realized that digital platforms not only attract players, but also provide a wealth of data to analyze behavior and optimize the offer. Players could thus be addressed individually and motivated to play longer, a development that brought opportunities and risks in equal measure. Parallel to casino games, the area of online betting also developed. Sports betting, lotteries, and virtual competitions were offered on digital platforms that tapped into global markets. People from different countries could now participate, compare, bet, and win at the same time. Gambling was no longer limited to geographical boundaries. It became a worldwide phenomenon. A decisive factor for the development was the security of the transactions. Initially skeptical about online payments, players were slow to dare to transfer money to digital platforms. With the introduction of encrypted payment methods and secure servers, trust grew, and more people discovered the possibilities of online gambling. Digital currencies such as Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies expanded the possibilities even further by enabling anonymous, fast, and cross-border transactions. The digital world changed not only accessibility, but also the nature of games themselves. Slot machines became more interactive, card and dice games got new features, and live casino platforms made it possible to play with real croupiers in real time. Players felt like they were sitting right at the table in Las Vegas, even though they were physically in their own homes. This immersion increased the tension and intensity of the gaming experience. At the same time, online gambling brought new psychological aspects with it. The constant availability and fast game sequence meant that players were active longer and more intensively than in traditional casinos. Reward systems have been specifically designed to increase engagement and retention. The digital design, animations, sound effects, and visual stimuli help to make the player more emotionally involved. However, a key advantage of online gambling has been the democratization of access. People who previously had no access to physical casinos for geographical, social, or economic reasons were now able to participate. At the same time, this opened up new markets and target groups that were previously untapped. Gambling thus became more global, more diverse, and more dynamic. But this development also brought challenges. Regulation, youth protection, and player protection became central topics. State authorities had to enact new laws, issue licenses, and monitor platforms to curb fraud, manipulation, and illegal offers. This regulation remains a central aspect of the online gambling industry to this day. In addition, the global nature of the internet led to conflicts between different legal systems. While certain games were legal in one country, they could be banned in another. Operators had to find ways to account for these differences to stay on the safe side legally. At the same time, this global reach opened up opportunities for innovation and growth. Another important aspect of the digital revolution has been the development of mobile platforms. With smartphones and tablets, players could participate anytime and anywhere. This mobility fundamentally changed behavior. Gambling became a flexible, constant companion in everyday life. Push notifications, app designs, and personalized offers increased player engagement and made the experience even more accessible. Parallel to the technical development, social aspects also changed. Online communities emerged in which players exchanged strategies, gave tips, or shared their experiences. Tournaments, leaderboards, and virtual competitions reinforced the sense of community and emotional attachment to the platforms. Digital gambling became a social experience, although it was often played individually. Psychologically, online gambling brought new dynamics. Players experienced more intense climaxes, but could also get into loss spirals more quickly. Addictive mechanisms were reinforced, as the rapid succession of events and constant availability could lead to impulsive behavior. Researchers and prevention programs have therefore increasingly had to deal with the specific risks of the digital environment. At the same time, digitization offered new opportunities for prevention. Platforms can monitor game times, set limits, and issue alerts. Data analysis makes it possible to identify problematic behavior at an early stage and offer appropriate measures. This combination of technology and responsibility is a key advantage of online gambling that would be difficult to implement in traditional casinos. A particularly noteworthy point is the role of virtual reality and advanced technologies. As early as the beginning of the 21st century, developers were experimenting with immersive casino experiences where players could fully immerse themselves in virtual worlds. This opens up completely new dimensions of experience. Players can move around in digital replicas of real casinos, interact with avatars, and experience games in real time. The boundaries between reality and simulation are becoming increasingly blurred. At the same time, it is creating a new era of innovation. Developers combine elements of gaming, social interaction, and classic casino games to create unique experiences. The future of gambling seems to be not only digital, but also interactive, personalized, and globally connected. But despite all the technological advances, the core idea remains unchanged: the tension of the unknown, the hope of profit, and the emotional intensity of a single moment. Online gambling has simply created new ways to make this experience accessible and amplifying. It is a continuation of the same fascination that began thousands of years ago in prehistory with simple cubes. When we look at the digital revolution, we see that gambling not only uses technological innovations, but is also deeply rooted in human psychology, culture, and history. It combines ancient traditions with modern technologies, individual experience with global networking, and risk with entertainment. With the 21st century, gambling is thus on the threshold of further developments. Cryptocurrencies, blockchain technology, and increasingly immersive digital environments promise new forms of interaction. At the same time, the question of how to balance freedom, risk, and protection remains central, a topic that has accompanied the history of gambling since its inception. In the next chapter, we will explore the psychological aspects of gambling in more detail: why people gamble, what mechanisms work, and how hope, risk, and addictive behaviors are connected. Chapter 14: Psychology of Gambling. Gambling has fascinated mankind for thousands of years. From the first bone throwing in prehistory to dice games in ancient Mesopotamia to the virtual casinos of the 21st century, one thing remains constant: the psychological effect of the game on people. The focus is not only on the chance of winning, but above all on the way our brain reacts to risk, reward, and uncertainty. The fascination begins with the perception of chance. Humans are biologically programmed to recognize patterns, even where none exist. This ability was vital in prehistory in order to recognize dangers at an early stage or to optimize hunting. In the context of gambling, it leads us to make connections between gaming events, see patterns, or develop strategies, even if the outcome is purely random. A player who believes now is the time to win follows an intuitive pattern thinking, a mixture of hope and cognitive bias. In addition to pattern recognition, the reward system in the brain plays a decisive role. Gains activate dopamine releases, which create a sense of joy, relief, and motivation. Even small wins or apparent successes reinforce this system. Interestingly, the brain reacts not only to real gains, but also to close gains, the so-called near-miss phenomenon. If you lose by a narrow margin, you will still experience a similar neural activation as with a real win, which makes the game particularly engaging. This reward principle explains why people are willing to take risks. Gambling offers short, intense climaxes, moments in which the outcome seems uncontrollable to us. Emotions rise and dopamine is released. These moments are immediate, intense, and immediately available repeatedly. The player returns again and again, driven by the hope of the next reward boost. But the psychological effect goes even further. Gambling interacts strongly with emotions such as hope, frustration, and fear. Hope arises before each round of the game. The feeling of expectation of a win motivates you to continue. Frustration arises when reality doesn't live up to expectations, and often reinforces the urge to make it up. Fear can also play a role, especially the fear of missing an opportunity, which is known in psychology as FOMO, fear of missing out. Another central phenomenon is loss aversion. People react more emotionally to losses than to gains of the same amount. If you lose, you feel the emotional impact more intensely than if you win the same amount. This principle explains why gamblers often try to recoup losses immediately, even if the probability of winning does not increase. The psychological pressure leads to impulsive decisions and can lead to problematic gambling behavior. The social dimension also plays an important role. Gambling is not just an individual experience. Whether in saloons, casinos, or online communities, the presence of other people influences behavior and emotions. Group activity, observation, and competition create additional appeal. Players compare their results, learn from others, and experience recognition or envy. These social mechanisms increase motivation and increase the intensity of the experience. An often underestimated factor is the role of rituals and habits. Players often develop fixed routines, certain sequences when drawing cards, special gestures when rolling the dice, or personal lucky charms. Such rituals convey a feeling of control over the uncontrollable. From a psychological point of view, they reduce stress, strengthen self-efficacy, and strengthen the bond with the game. The design of the games themselves also makes targeted use of psychological mechanisms. Slot machines, digital casinos, and even classic card games are designed in such a way that rewards, sounds, visual effects, and timing activate the brain's reward system. Short, intense game segments, variable winning opportunities, and near-miss situations ensure that players remain emotionally captivated. These mechanisms are not random, but the result of decades of experience in the field of game psychology. A crucial aspect of the psychological effect is the relationship between risk and reward. People are motivated to take risks when the potential reward seems high. This relationship is perceived subjectively. A small but certain win is often less attractive than a large, uncertain win. Gambling uses this human tendency systematically, from lotteries to poker to modern online casinos. But not all people react in the same way. Psychological dispositions, experiences, and personality traits influence gambling behavior. People who are willing to take risks, impulsive types, or people who react strongly to reward signals tend to exhibit more intense gambling behavior. At the same time, previous experiences play a role. Those who experienced gambling in the family in childhood often develop a higher interest and a stronger emotional commitment. Problematic gambling behavior arises when the psychological mechanisms exceed the control over the behavior. Gambling addiction is a recognized behavioral disorder characterized by repetitive, compulsive gambling, despite negative consequences. It is facilitated by the combination of reward systems, loss aversion, social pressure, and emotional dysregulation. Psychologists and addiction researchers have studied these mechanisms intensively. They show that gambling is not just a question of morality or willpower, but is a complex interaction of neurobiology, behavior, and environment. At the same time, prevention and intervention strategies have been developed. Limits, warnings, self-exclusion programs, and education about risk mechanisms can reduce problematic behavior. The psychological dimension of gambling also explains why modern developments such as online and mobile gambling are so effective. The constant availability, personalized offers, fast game cycles, and immersive designs make optimal use of the familiar mechanisms. At the same time, they increase the risk of playing impulsively, experiencing emotional ups and downs intensely, and increasing addiction potential. But gambling is not only risk. Psychologically, it also offers positive effects: tension, entertainment, social interaction, mental training, and emotional stimulation. Players experience challenge, self-efficacy, and a sense of achievement, factors that are an important part of leisure behavior for many people. Overall, the psychology of gambling shows that the game is much more than a mere random experience. It combines emotional, cognitive, social, and biological mechanisms. It is a complex phenomenon that has fascinated and challenged people for thousands of years. Understanding these mechanisms is crucial to seizing opportunities, identifying risks, and promoting responsible gambling. With this knowledge in mind, we can take a look into the future, at technologies, trends, and new game worlds that will shape gambling in the coming decades. Psychology remains the key. It explains why people gamble, how they perceive risks, and what dynamics drive them, regardless of whether dice are thrown, cards are drawn, or virtual slots are spun.
Kapitel 15 – Die Zukunft des Glücksspiels. Das Glücksspiel hat eine lange und bewegte Geschichte hinter sich. Von den ersten Würfen der Urgeschichte über antike Würfelspiele, die Casinos der Renaissance und den Saloons des Wilden Westens bis hin zur digitalen Revolution und Online-Casinos des 21. Jahrhunderts. Doch während wir diese Vergangenheit betrachten, stellt sich die Frage: Wie sieht die Zukunft des Glücksspiels aus? Welche Entwicklungen werden die Branche, die Spieler und die Gesellschaft in den kommenden Jahrzehnten prägen? Die wohl offensichtlichste Veränderung ist die technologische Weiterentwicklung. Schon im 21. Jahrhundert haben Computer, das Internet und Mobilgeräte das Glücksspiel revolutioniert. Doch die kommenden Jahre versprechen noch tiefgreifendere Veränderungen. Virtual Reality, VR, und Augmented Reality, AR, ermöglichen immersivere Erlebnisse, bei denen Spieler nicht mehr nur vor einem Bildschirm sitzen, sondern vollständig in digitale Spielwelten eintauchen. Ein virtueller Casinoraum könnte den physischen Strip von Las Vegas nachbilden oder völlig neue, fantasievolle Umgebungen erschaffen, die bisher undenkbar waren. In einer solchen Umgebung verschwimmen die Grenzen zwischen Realität und Simulation, und das Spielerlebnis wird intensiver, emotionaler und interaktiver. Parallel dazu entwickelt sich die Blockchain-Technologie zu einem weiteren zentralen Baustein der Zukunft des Glücksspiels. Kryptowährungen ermöglichen nicht nur schnelle, globale und anonyme Transaktionen, sondern auch neue Formen von Spielen, die auf Smart Contracts basieren. Diese automatisierten Programme können Spielregeln, Auszahlungen und Wahrscheinlichkeiten transparent und manipulationssicher gestalten. Damit könnten Spieler Vertrauen gewinnen, das bisher oft durch illegale Anbieter oder undurchsichtige Systeme in Frage gestellt wurde. Gleichzeitig eröffnen Blockchain-basierte Plattformen völlig neue Märkte, in denen Spieler weltweit miteinander interagieren können, ohne auf zentrale Anbieter angewiesen zu sein. Die Kombination aus VR, AR und Blockchain eröffnet völlig neue Spielkonzepte. Man kann sich vorstellen, dass Spieler in virtuellen Städten unterwegs sind, Turniere in Echtzeit gegeneinander spielen oder in dynamischen, interaktiven Umgebungen Einsätze platzieren. Die Möglichkeiten sind nahezu unbegrenzt. Von Multiplayer-Casinos über virtuelle Sportveranstaltungen bis hin zu komplett neuen Genres, die Elemente aus Videospielen, Glücksspiel und sozialer Interaktion kombinieren. Doch technologische Innovationen bringen auch neue Herausforderungen mit sich. Datenschutz, Betrugsprävention, Regulierung und Spielerschutz müssen an die neuen Umgebungen angepasst werden. Immersive Plattformen könnten das Risiko von Spielsucht erhöhen, da Spieler noch intensiver in das Erlebnis eintauchen und reale Zeit und Ressourcen verlieren könnten. Entsprechend müssen Präventionssysteme entwickelt werden, die in Echtzeit reagieren, Limits setzen und Spieler unterstützen können. Neben der Technologie wird die gesellschaftliche Wahrnehmung des Glücksspiels weiterhin eine zentrale Rolle spielen. Während Legalisierung und Regulierung in vielen Ländern bereits etabliert sind, stehen die politischen und ethischen Fragen noch lange nicht abschließend fest. Soll das Glücksspiel stärker kontrolliert werden, um Suchtprävention und Fairness zu gewährleisten? Oder sollen Spieler ihre Freiheit maximal ausleben können, auch wenn dies Risiken birgt? Die Antworten werden die Branche stark prägen und bestimmen, welche Konzepte sich durchsetzen. Ein weiterer Trend ist die zunehmende Integration von künstlicher Intelligenz, KI, in das Glücksspiel. KI kann personalisierte Spielerlebnisse schaffen, indem sie das Verhalten der Nutzer analysiert, Vorlieben erkennt und adaptive Angebote bereitstellt. Gleichzeitig kann KI auch im Spielerschutz eingesetzt werden. Sie erkennt Risikoverhalten frühzeitig, warnt Spieler oder begrenzt Einsätze automatisch. Damit wird es möglich, Chancen und Risiken individuell auszubalancieren und sowohl Spieler als auch Betreiber besser zu unterstützen. Die wirtschaftliche Dimension des Glücksspiels wird ebenfalls weiter wachsen. Globalisierung, Mobile-Endgeräte und digitale Plattformen ermöglichen es, dass Millionen von Menschen gleichzeitig spielen können. Branchenübergreifende Kooperationen, zum Beispiel mit Videospielentwicklern, Streaming-Plattformen oder Unterhaltungsunternehmen, eröffnen neue Geschäftsmodelle. Spieler werden Teil umfangreicherer Erlebniswelten, in denen Glücksspiel nur ein Element eines umfassenden Unterhaltungspakets ist. Auch die soziale Dimension wird sich verändern. Online-Communities, Turniere und Livestreaming schaffen neue soziale Bindungen zwischen Spielern weltweit. Virtuelle Casinos und Turniere werden zu Orten der Begegnung, des Wettbewerbs und des Austauschs. Das Glücksspiel wird so nicht nur als individuelles Erlebnis, sondern als gemeinschaftliche Aktivität wahrgenommen. Parallel zu diesen globalen Entwicklungen werden kulturelle Unterschiede weiterhin eine Rolle spielen. In manchen Regionen werden digitale Casinos dominieren, in anderen bleibt das physische Casino der bevorzugte Ort. Traditionelle Spiele wie Poker, Roulette oder Baccarat werden weiterhin bestehen, während neue Formate entstehen, die stärker auf digitale Mechaniken, Interaktivität und personalisierte Erlebnisse setzen. Die Vielfalt des Glücksspielangebots wird damit weiter zunehmen und eine breitere Zielgruppe ansprechen. Nicht zuletzt wird die Wissenschaft weiterhin eine Schlüsselrolle spielen. Psychologen, Neurowissenschaftler und Verhaltensforscher werden das Spielverhalten analysieren, Risikoprofile erstellen und Präventionsmaßnahmen entwickeln. Die Kombination aus technologischer Innovation, datengetriebenem Verständnis und regulatorischer Kontrolle könnte dazu führen, dass Glücksspiel in der Zukunft verantwortungsbewusster, individueller und gleichzeitig immersiver wird. Doch trotz aller technologischen und gesellschaftlichen Veränderungen bleibt ein Kern unverändert: das menschliche Bedürfnis nach Spannung, Risiko und Belohnung. Die Mechanismen, die Menschen seit Jahrtausenden antreiben, Hoffnung, Dopamin, der Reiz des Ungewissen, werden sich nicht ändern. Was sich jedoch ändern wird, ist die Art und Weise, wie diese Mechanismen bedient werden, wie sie gestaltet, verstärkt oder reguliert werden. Wenn wir die Zukunft des Glücksspiels betrachten, sehen wir eine Branche im ständigen Wandel. Sie kombiniert jahrtausendealte Traditionen mit den neuesten Technologien, menschliche Psychologie mit globaler Vernetzung und wirtschaftliche Chancen mit ethischen Herausforderungen. Spieler, Betreiber und Gesellschaft stehen vor der Aufgabe, dieses komplexe Gefüge zu gestalten, Chancen zu nutzen und Risiken zu begrenzen. Vielleicht liegt die größte Herausforderung darin, ein Gleichgewicht zu finden. Zwischen Faszination und Verantwortung, zwischen Freiheit und Schutz, zwischen Spielspaß und Suchtprävention. Wer dieses Gleichgewicht findet, kann die Chancen der digitalen Zukunft des Glücksspiels optimal nutzen, ohne die Risiken zu vernachlässigen. Die Geschichte des Glücksspiels endet damit keineswegs. Sie entwickelt sich weiter, dynamisch, global und technologisch immer fortschreitender. Doch der Kern bleibt derselbe: der Moment der Spannung, der Reiz des Ungewissen, die Hoffnung auf Gewinn und die Faszination, die Menschen seit Jahrtausenden antreibt. In dieser Kontinuität liegt die Kraft des Glücksspiels. Und in der digitalen Revolution die Aussicht auf eine Zukunft, die so spannend ist wie noch nie zuvor.